We've looked at both rational accounts of the journey toward the meaning of life and non-rational accounts. Kant, a rational account. The Romantics, in differing ways, not so rational accounts, maybe non-rational ones. But each gives us a kind of guidance. Neither talks a lot about history. The philosopher we'll look at now is Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and he talks about the role of history in human life. Hegel is probably one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of philosophy, and his understanding of our human situation, even if we pervasively reject it, determines much of our philosophical understanding and sense of how to guide our lives even today. Very much we live in the aftermath of Hegel and his sense of history. Now, what were some of the influential pre-Hegelian accounts of history? And in what terms did they understand history's actual purpose? Well, one account would view history as cyclical. History is just a recurring. In the Hebrew Bible, we have the book of Ecclesiastes, says there's nothing new under the sun. Things just keep happening in a kind of cycle. And the Greeks had a notion of history as cycle. And that suggested, it's also found in parts of the philosopher Plato, that what we need is an escape from history. That's a controversial notion, as if we could go beyond or above history and no longer be caught, trapped by its cycles. If you think of the axial attitude that life is a journey from here to an elsewhere, well, that axial attitude is even found in some of the cyclical accounts, and it's also found in reincarnation theory. Now, if we do a brief account of history with reference to guides who have perhaps suggested that we get beyond history, that might help us. There's the view that we find in Plato that what we have to do is get out of a cave of ignorance and be guided beyond shadows and appearances and an experience of things that is confusing to us to a bright daylight. We might also mention Socrates, of course, one of the great figures of Western philosopher who saw philosophy as learning how to die, as escaping the body, as leaving the prison of the body and finding an elsewhere that is beyond the recurrent events that happen in history. There's also the Stoic notion. It has many forms, but one of its norms and forms is that whether history is cyclical or going someplace, history is dangerous, and it is best that we detach ourselves from it. We do not get involved in it. We take a step back. If the Romantics thought that the industrial, urban, conventional world was something to get away from, to discover imagination and creativity, the Stoics thought that the whole world was problematic in terms of the things that happened in it, things that could spin out of control, destructive things. And some of these Stoics counseled a detachment, that we would step back from what was happening in history. And there are also messianic notions. They're more linear, that a Messiah figure, an anointed one, would come and lead us beyond the travails of history. And many religious people hold strongly to that view. And there are also Eastern mystical notions, notions that we could be delivered through meditation from history, and either deep within us or in another kind of dimension experience peace. Well, what could be made of Hegel's very influential account of the development of history? It involves the notion of spirit, which is a new notion for us to consider in our journey to try to understand whether there could be, from a philosophical standpoint, a meaning to life. Hegel understands us, what we are as human beings, in terms of spirit. Now, in German, the word spirit is Geist, G-E-I-S-T, and it's so hard to get translated properly into our language of English, because spirit is not spirits as in something you might drink, or spirit is in ghosts. For Hegel, spirit is a fundamental energy that we have. It is a fusion of elements in us. Think of spirit for Hegel as a process that is us, that we undergo, that drives us forward. Hegel was very, very reluctant to think of human beings as a consciousness or a mind. It sounds so mental. It makes us sound like spectators. What Hegel thought was that that would be misleading, because if you understand spirit as dynamic energy, that's really what we are. And Hegel understood that dynamic energy, if we were to explain it in Kant's terms, as a fusion of reason and imagination. But Hegel didn't want to say reason and imagination. What he wanted to say was spirit, and that spirit was a fundamental unity. That it is, will always be a totality. That it is never just a cognitive capacity. See, the Greeks and much of Western philosophy thought, oh, the journey of life was simply to know. But Hegel thought knowing was important, but there was a lot more than knowing involved in the journey of living. Knowing was important to the discovery of the meaning of life, but it wasn't the full story. Now, Hegel says that our spirit, which is what we are, has, well, it has a problematic reflexivity to it. Pause with me now. We have to get this clear because this is an important notion, not completely easy, but we can get it. That we're not just a something, like an apple is an apple, or a rock is a rock. We as people relate to ourselves. We have a relation to ourselves, and that relation we have to ourselves is just as much us as the self we relate to. He articulated this in terms of categories of in itself and for itself. We are who we are, but we also have experiences, perceptions, and images of ourselves. And these images we have of ourselves, these conceptions, they are just as much a part of who we are as the self that we are, that we have conceptions about. There's me, there's how I see me. These can be in conflict. But me and how I see me, you and how you see yourself, that also is who and what you are, even if you and I and how we see ourselves are in conflict with each other. Hegel adds to this complex situation when he says that the way we relate to ourselves is in what he calls a mediated manner. It's not just that I have a direct relation to myself. My relation to myself is embedded in the world and the experiences in which I'm involved. It's embedded in culture. It's embedded in political situations. I don't just relate to myself in a vacuum. For instance, think of medieval people. They not only were people, they sustained certain kinds of relations to themselves. But it was a medieval world they lived in, so their relation that they understood themselves to have with themselves had medieval clothing to it. Take the Romantics. The Romantics just simply weren't the specific, separate, creative individuals that they were. They also had a relation with themselves through which they understood themselves. And that relation took place in, yes, you guessed it, a romantic environment of being an outsider, of being creative, of getting glimpses of perhaps some deep reality within or mysterious reality beyond. That entered into how they related to themselves and related intimately. Now, there are intimations in Hegel, but they're only intimations that maybe you could transcend the context, the environment in which you found yourself related to yourself. But he talks on the one hand about belief, on the other side, a special insight. And as he untangles the notions of what we believe about ourselves and possibly a separate special insight we get about ourselves, he decides that we couldn't, finally, when all is said and done, have a relation to ourselves that didn't find itself embedded in circumstances. You see, I couldn't be me, the same me, in a romantic world as in a medieval world. And none of us on the journey of life can be anything other than we are in the world in which we find ourselves. But now, as Hegel spins this out, as Hegel says we relate to ourselves in a context, and the context is an historical one, there are problems. He has the notion of absolute spirit. Not your spirit, my spirit along the journey of life, but an absolute spirit. And that's his successor notion to God. Hegel understands God as being the unfolding of human history. And therefore, he understands God as history itself. And he understands the unfolding of history as God's autobiography. Now, this is very difficult because awful things happen in history. At any time you listen to me, at any time you look around, terrible things are happening. If history is God's autobiography, how do you explain that these terrible things are happening? This is a deep problem for Hegel. It's very highly problematic. Let's consider. Let's consider very closely. History is God's autobiography, but awful things happen in history. What does that tell us about God? What does it tell us about reality? One thing we are told is we have to separate moral from creative activities. Maybe awful things happen in history, but in the course of these awful things happening in history, maybe creative consequences arise. Maybe there are extraordinary triumphs for the human spirit. I mean, one could say, for example, look at a wonderful cathedral. We don't pay attention to the fact that countless people may have suffered. Maybe they worked beyond their capacities to build the cathedral. We just are taken by the fact that, well, there it is. There is the result. Maybe that we could understand history as having a creative meaning, even though from a moral standpoint, some bad things happen. Now, Hegel also tells us that spirit develops over historical time in a manner that he calls dialectical. He says if you look at history, it's a set of conflicts. There are things in history that don't add up. Plato says they don't add up at a high level, and that if we look at the furthest point of our reason, we can see ways in which things don't make full sense. And Kant says, well, we've already talked about this in our journey, that reason just simply can't, without contradiction, let us know how things really are. But Hegel's notion of dialectic is different. You and I, on the journey of life, and he talks about this in the Phenomenology of Spirit, are very much caught up in conflicts. And if history is God's autobiography, if history is the history of God's consciousness, then we have to realize that not only our individual lives, but the life of absolute spirit itself, Hegel's substitute word for God, well, it's a history of all kinds of conflicts. Things don't add up. There are existential problems, that is, things that aren't rationally discordant, but nonetheless don't work out in terms of our individual lives. And there are socioeconomic forces at work that also are part of this conflict. And they too, these socioeconomic forces at work, these kind of conflicts, also part of the history of spirit, also part of the unfolding of the life of the divine mind. They too are part and parcel of our consciousness and the consciousness of the Absolute. Hegel has a view that's much spoofed, parodied, but we need better to understand what it is because it's even been written in a different way in the last 20 years. That view is that history's come to an end. Oh, bosh. Here you are. Here I am. Looks like history's going on. Some good things are happening. Some terrible things are happening. What Hegel meant to say history had come to an end is that the life of spirit had played itself out in terms of the possibilities available to spirit. Things would keep happening, but nothing new could happen. It would just be a variation of what had already happened. And Hegel has the notion, in German the word is Aufhebung, very, very hard to translate. Hegel thinks that the conflicts of history in which you and I find ourselves, and history itself understood as the unfolding of a divine consciousness, well, the conflicts involved we live through and get to the other side of. We don't resolve a conflict by abandoning a conflicting element. We absorb it. That's his bold, courageous, dynamic, spirited, energetic notion of what the best could be for us in the journey of life, and what the best is of the human spirit, and what the meaning of life is. For Hegel, the meaning of life is to realize that we are a process, we participate in history, history has come to an end, and that all history's great possibilities have played themselves out. And from Hegel's standpoint, from the beginning of the 19th century, all we can do, finally, is recapitulate what's already happened. The great things have been done. There are no new things to do, just variations of what's already happened. Hegel's account puts great emphasis on the role of what we could think of as great people, heroes of history. These are the people that, on Hegel's account, move history. They are the great ones, the ones that in some way matter and move one stage of history to the next. If we can just pause for a moment at this point and think about this, if we can just pause and think about it, if Hegel is right, there are these stages in history in which we find ourselves, and occasionally the conflicts underlying whatever our stage in history is become so powerful that there needs to be a great person, some form of hero that will emerge, who will, with courage, embrace the conflicts and find a way to the other side of the conflicts. Not so much just solve the conflicts, but live through them, absorb them, and move beyond. Hegel says, and we will see him attacked for this, that ideas are the prime movers of history, not social or economic forces, but ideas. And we're going to see this attacked as our journey continues. Hegel will tell us that the meaning of history is found in ideas, that ideas move history, and that what you and I can do is participate in, come to understand what these ideas have been, live with them, experience them, and have fully absorbed them, and in that way, to have a full life. And it is through great people that these ideas emerge. Actually, it's Hegel's view that even the people who move history, the ones who carry forward great ideas that embrace and get beyond conflicts, may not know that this is what they're doing. Hegel calls this the cunning of reason. He calls it the cunning of reason, that somehow there is a movement that occurs that even the great ones who forward it do not know that they're doing this. And Hegel also has the notion of a great political leader. And a great political leader is one who forms a context in which ideas can be pursued and culture can be developed. Hegel not only thinks ideas move history, but there must be a context in which ideas are forwarded. And it is political leaders who, in special circumstances, move us forward by creating a stable context. And Hegel also tells us that what rights we possess, you and I in our journey of life, we possess within a stable context that the great leaders provide, and that therefore our duties are to the context that has been provided, that allows us to move forward. Hegel, in fact, thinking that you need a stable context and that great political leaders provide it, has a very activist notion of the state. The state is not just an umpire that allows people to do what they want and keeps them from colliding too often. For Hegel, a state provides cultural benefit. Further, Hegel has a notion of the philosopher. Well, the philosopher is someone who is able to understand and articulate what the great human possibilities have been. The philosopher is the person who is able to understand and be one with the highest of human possibilities. Even if these ideas are part of the past, we can recreate them in our minds and imaginations. And the journey of life is to know what these great ideas were and to be able to embody them. In this, Hegel is very influenced by a philosopher, artist, writer, politician named Johann von Goethe. Goethe, G-O-E-T-H-E, lived mostly in the 18th but into the 19th century, said you must have full experience. You must experience every phase of life. Only the great ones move history forward, but each of us can re-experience and recapitulate what these phases were, what they were like, and what they've contributed to the human spirit. Well, that's an alternative vision to the spectatorial standpoint of the Greeks, where we are simply meant to know, and it's a kind of a different view than an ecstatic view that comes from some religions that mystically takes us out of experience. Hegel's idea is recapitulate, re-experience what the dynamic ideas have been. Well, there's a tension in Hegel, and an important tension, and we need to say something about that. Hegel thinks that there's formal morality. That's Kant's duty, but there are also concretely embedded customs. And Hegel thinks Kant's formal morality, duty, 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 keep desire under tow, is too formal, too abstract. It doesn't really tell us much to do. And he thinks that human history develops in terms of customs that are embedded in communities, and that we find what we'll call our moral life within these communities. But of course that raises serious problems sometimes for community members. What happens if some people, to be creative, must be, in a customary or in almost any sense, immoral? What does that say about life and its meaning? What does it say about life and its meaning if you live in a community where you will go along with its customs or even a formal morality, but perhaps at the cost of creative activity? Or what's it like if creative activity requires that you break formal rules of morality or that you violate customs? There are examples of this. Beethoven is one, perhaps. Picasso is accused of not being such a nice person, but being very creative. And some have even said that perhaps the creativity only came because of the kind of life, not one to be thoroughly proud of, that Picasso lived. Same sort of thing has been said about James Joyce. So Hegel says we live in communities, we are embodiments of the development of the spirit, but there are conflicts that arise as a result of these circumstances. Spirit is meant to be creative, but creativity may come only through situations where we have to violate customary and formal moral standards. What to do about this? It's been said that the great person is seldom good. It is the great person that moves history. But is it true to move history, whether to create a state, a government, a stable context? Is it true that to do that, you can't always do it as a good person? Hegel has trouble working out how it is that greatness and the kind of creativity that moves history can be reconciled with our normal moralities. He also thinks that we're caught up in situations that involve dominance and subordinates. On Hegel's view, equality is hard achieved at the deepest level. Hegel also emphasizes passion. Whereas Kant called passion a cancer, Hegel says that only is it possible for great things to emerge. Only ever will they emerge as a result of great passion, the great embrace of ideas. And Hegel also tells us that part of the journey of life involves that we recognize each other, and that a recognition of person to person in a stable context is absolutely fundamental for our enrichment. Well, this is heady stuff. We got the notion of history as God's autobiography. We see that history moves in terms of ideas. There are creative spirits who supposedly move history not always knowing that they're doing it. And we have this frightful notion that maybe the great movements of history are at the cost of ordinary morals, customary moral life, formal moral principles. What to say about this? Well, Hegel wants to write a history of human life which says we all, in differing ways, some of us a little more knowingly, most of us not knowingly at all, have participated in a great narrative, which is the unfolding of what then we would call God's consciousness. Now, Hegel actually doesn't say, he's often accused of this, he doesn't say, well, everything's worked out wonderfully. So we have all kinds of atrocities, we have all kinds of natural disasters, but history is God's story, and it's a wonderful story because God is God. All Hegel finally really says about this is that you can tell a story. You can tell a story about how human history has unfolded that makes sense. It doesn't completely end the troubles. It doesn't make everything right, but there's a way of telling the story of human history through which we can say, yes, it actually is worth it. The human race has been something and meant something. Maybe the journey of life, to find the meaning of life, is to be able to look back at history and say, in the midst of all the terrible things that happened, wonderful things have happened too. We can see what those wonderful things are, and at least in our imagination, in our thoughts, we can re-experience them. We can't go back to the Middle Ages, but we may know what it would have been like to have been medieval and absorb that too, and come to see that there is a whole world of different experiences, and maybe they come in a sequence. And even if they're played out, even if history is over, that there couldn't be anything new, maybe we can relive imaginatively what these stages have been, and we can say, in effect, been there, done that. We can know what it has been to be human and what life is about. Well, this is quite a daring notion. It's a daring notion to view history as that important. A daring notion to think that the journey of life doesn't have to do altogether with your individual life or my individual life. It has a lot more to do with the development of history and our ability imaginatively to relive history's moments, and our ability to detect great people and see how they've embraced the most difficult of situations and gotten to the other side. And maybe when they got to the other side, it has become a different world. And maybe we can relive, if only in our imagination, those stages. That's Hegel's grand picture. It's a grand picture of how history can be recapitulated in us, and how we can see that great ideas, even ideas not understood at the time by the people that moved them forward, have been the elements, exactly those ideas, that have moved history. But then, what does this tell us about our freedom, your freedom and my freedom? If we're thinking about a journey toward the meaning of life, and life is to be understood as a journey, where does freedom fit into Hegel's account? Are we caught in a situation where we just observe a great history that's happened? Where is our freedom in this? Now, I've mentioned the state, the government. A stable context is necessary for us to understand these things. What role, closer looked at, does government and the state play in Hegel's account?